This week comes after a couple of political conventions, and we have a lot to look at in terms of what's occurred in the last 2 weeks, particularly in terms of fact-checking and figuring out where we are in reference to environmental questions. We're in trouble in many respects because we're not being told the straight story, and that's a bit what we want to look at today in Eco-Views and News. We're going to focus on, in effect, the Republican convention that took place 2 weeks ago, and the title that we're focusing on is Smirks, Lies, and Videotapes, the Billionaires Convention and Tea Party. As you know, we had a full week, well, 4 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then follow-up on Friday of the Republican convention. A large part of the conversation around which sort of focused on the question of how much truth was being told in these speeches, either by the vice presidential candidate Ryan or by Romney himself. And in fact, a lot of different organizations got into checking what they call the facts in these kinds of things, and it wasn't altogether encouraging. Things like Romney's claim to have a plan to create 12 million jobs. Well, these things were looked at, but in fact, if you looked at it in detail, a lot of the commentators realized, well, these weren't really genuine, in effect, genuine claims, because in effect, these kinds of jobs might have been created anyway. In other words, that's the kind of thing that would be created in the U.S. economy over the time of any forthcoming president. So the idea that the jobs are being created because you might elect him is a bit misleading. In fact, more than a bit misleading. It's downright on the edge of being a bit of a lie. Take a look at some of the commentary. This is what came through from NBC, and let's see, in fact, if we can get the sound to work on it, because it's important to get this kind of commentary from the mainstream news. Mainstream news isn't always accurate. In fact, there's a lot of times in which it's not accurate, but it's worth getting its representation to see how it's presenting some of these candidates at this particular time. The candidates in this case are in effect being presented in a very different light depending upon whether you hear them on different networks. And in this particular case, it's MSNBC that has this commentary about Romney's candidacy. Let's listen to it now with the sound.
The Obama campaign is swinging back this morning, saying, quote, Mitt Romney's speech last night offered many personal attacks and gauzy platitudes, but no tangible ideas to move the country forward. One big headline from last night's speech was Romney's promise to boost the job market.
Now, like the president, I have a plan to create 12 million new jobs.
Here to help us separate fact from fiction is the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler. Hey, Glenn, we have so much to get to. I know your policy not to issue those infamous or famous Pinocchios the day after a speech, but you've done some fact checking. What about the job promise?
Well, 12 million jobs sounds like a lot. Sounds like a definitive pledge. The actual policy paper that the Romney campaign put out doesn't really explain how he gets there. It just offers ideas like free trade and that sort of thing. And actually, many economists predict that 12 million jobs will be created over the next 4 years. So what they did is they took a number that is a generally considered consensus number, assuming you don't have another recession because of the fiscal cliff. So it was a pretty safe bet to make that promise, because that's what economists expect will happen no matter who's president.
All right.
Well, that's pretty simple. Take credit for what's going to happen anyway. Well, let's look at a few of the other issues that were raised in the speech.
Let's talk taxes, and I'll play another clip from last night.
And let me make this very clear. Unlike President Obama, I will not raise taxes on the middle class of America.
Let me ask you, did President Obama raise taxes on the middle class?
Well, not really. I think what Governor Romney is referring to is the mandates that are part of the health care reform bill, and that there are people in the middle class that if they didn't buy health insurance could possibly be hit with a fine, which the Supreme Court defined as a tax. But more broadly speaking, Obama has a record of actually cutting taxes for the middle class. He extended the Bush tax cuts. There was a tax credit in the stimulus bill. The payroll tax has been reduced by 2 percentage points over the last 2 years. So for most middle-class Americans, they got a tax cut.
We heard another familiar line. We've heard it from a lot of Republicans, but last night it was from Governor Romney. Let me play that.
His $716 billion cut to Medicare to finance Obamacare will both hurt today's seniors and depress innovation and jobs in medicine.
Is that exactly what it is, and is that what it'll do?
Well, yeah, this is taking advantage of some of the complexities of the federal budget. We hear this a lot. I generally give about 2 to 3 Pinocchios for this kind of statement. Governor Romney put it in a more gentle fashion, but essentially those so-called cuts are reductions in anticipated spending that would be given to providers. It does not affect beneficiaries, seniors. In fact, under the health care law, seniors get all sorts of benefits in terms of preventive care as well as fixing the donut hole. So I should note that his running mate, Paul Ryan, took the exact same so-called cuts and put them in his budget.
All right, let me ask you finally about...
Well, you get the pattern here. There's a stretching of truth and an outright falsehood represented in his characterization of Obama's programs, and then he goes on to claim credit for things that are going to happen anyway. I mean, this is really quite extraordinary, but very few commentators, except in this case this fellow who works with the Washington Post, calls him out on it. And it's interesting to see that pattern because, in fact, that wasn't the only circumstance. In fact, Robert Reich wrote an article after the speech focusing on that whole question. You may have been aware of Robert Reich when he was here at the Kennedy School. He's now out in California. But he wrote a column entitled, How Romney Keeps Lying Through His Big White Teeth. It's not too subtle. So on the 28th, he gives us this analysis of what Romney's lies were about, and in fact goes on to characterize what's really happening with the economy. Take a look. It's pretty interesting when you look at it. Put it out on YouTube so we can see it all out there.
Mitt Romney hasn't provided details of his economic plan, so we should be grateful he selected as vice president a man with a detailed plan that Romney says is marvelous, bold and exciting, excellent, much needed, consistent with his own plan. So let's take a look at the 5 basic features of this marvelous Ryan plan. First, it would boost unemployment because it slashes public spending next year and the year after when the economy is still likely to need a boost, not a fiscal drag. It would be the same austerity trap now throwing Europe into recession. According to the Economic Policy Institute, Ryan's plan would mean 1.3 million fewer jobs next year than otherwise and 2.8 million fewer the year after. Second, Ryan would take from lower-income Americans and give to the rich, who already have the biggest share of America's total income and wealth in almost a century. His plan would raise taxes on families earning between $30,000 and $40,000 by almost $500 a year and slash programs like Medicaid, food stamps, and children's health. And what would Ryan do with these savings? Reduce taxes on millionaires by an average of over $500,000 a year. Third, Ryan wants to turn Medicare into vouchers that won't keep up with the rising costs of health care, thereby shifting the burden onto seniors, ending their guaranteed health coverage and leaving them at the mercy of insurance companies. By contrast, Obama's Affordable Care Act saves money on Medicare by reducing payments to medical providers like hospitals and drug companies. Fourth, Ryan wants to add money to defense while cutting spending on education, infrastructure, and basic research and development. America already spends more on defense than the next 5 biggest military spenders put together. Our future productivity depends on the public investments Ryan wants to cut. Finally, Ryan's budget doesn't even reduce the federal budget deficit, not for decades. Remember, he's adding to military spending, giving huge additional tax cuts to the very rich, and stifling economic growth by cutting spending too early. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that Ryan's roadmap would push public debt to over 175% of gross domestic product by 2050. So there you have it. The Ryan-Romney economic plan, and the 5 reasons why it would be a disaster for America.
Okay, well, that's an editorial, in effect, by Robert Reich, former Labor Secretary under the Clinton administration, and analysis that he provides from his own work now in California. He's still teaching, in fact, and he's quite focused on what happens in the
After founding Bain.
Take a look, though, at the other aspects of the question of whether we're getting the straight story or not. It's pretty clear when it comes to the environment that there were a very interesting series of audio in the first instance without the video. I heard them on the radio first.
President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans. And to heal the planet. My promise is to help you and your family.
Well, clearly there's a lot of applause here, and it's a big point. He made a big point about how Obama was going to do one thing and he's going to do another. But if you listen to it on the radio, as I heard it first, you wonder what's the dynamic there, because you can't see what's going on in the hall on the radio. You just hear it. Let's listen to it again and listen where you think there are unexplained questions here being raised by the audio itself. Take a listen.
President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans.
Hear that? There's a long period of laughter with several waves of laughter and applause after he says President Obama promised to begin to reverse the rise of the oceans. Then there's this apparent applause from the public. Well, in the radio, you don't have anything else but that noise and applause and some laughter.
And to heal the planet.
More laughter. And you don't know why this laughter is coming. Are the people sort of laughing at the proposition that they might be victimized by climate change? Or are they laughing at something he's doing on the podium? Well, you can't tell in the radio. What you can tell is their response to his next proposition.
My promise is to help you and your family.
And a full 27 seconds, as long as the whole 27 seconds it took to deliver those two things, is then being given over to applause and great acclaim from the public here. Well, it is actually very instructive to go back and try to find the video for that same clip. First of all, to find out why there was this response of applause in the first instance, and then another wave upon wave of laughter. And it turns out that Fox News captured the video for us. In fact, we can see it in detail from the Fox video stream. It's been put up in a way that you can take a look at it here. Take a look. The full stream comes from a statement by Joe, and back to the convention itself. Take a look. Well, we'll see if we can capture it here, because it's actually pretty important to capture the reason for that laughter. And you can see it from the video stream. Let's see if we can find it through the confusion here. Apparently it's not coming up. Take a look, one more look at the live stream and see if we can. It's coming up through this portal, but it's basically going then to a story on the difference of that stream. More to the point, it was Romney's gestures from the podium. He bit his lip as if it were a joke, and people were responding to his presence of the joke rather than to the proposition, and that's why all the applause was coming forward. In terms of other facts, Romney apparently doesn't seem to be worried about the fact that fact checkers are looking at his other statements about welfare politics and the like and finding them very misleading. In fact, one article referred to the big racist lie at the center of the Romney-Ryan campaign. It's pretty extraordinary, because when the fact checkers pointed out that there's a lie, he doesn't stop doing it. In fact, he continues to do it. And in fact, it's pretty discouraging in some respects to see that the information
From NPR
doesn't
News, this
slow
is All
people
Things
down
Considered. I'm Melissa Block.
And I'm Audie Cornish. Today is the 16th anniversary of the bipartisan welfare overhaul signed by President Clinton. The law has become a major issue in this year's presidential campaign. Mitt Romney insists President Obama gutted the law, even though every major fact-checking organization says those attacks are false. NPR's Ari Shapiro looks at why the Romney campaign is sticking to its guns.
Mitt Romney rolled out this line of attack 2 weeks ago.
Under Obama's plan, you wouldn't have to work and wouldn't have to train for a job. They just send you your welfare check.
Since then, it has become a constant refrain in more ads and on the stump. Here was Romney last week in Zanesville, Ohio.
Going out and saying he's going to take the work requirement out of welfare. How in the world could he not understand the power of work, the dignity of work?
PolitiFact says Romney's claims are pants-on-fire bogus. The Washington Post's fact-checker awarded 4 Pinocchios the top rating, and factcheck.org reached the same conclusion that these claims are false. Even a Republican architect of the welfare law, Ron Haskins, told NPR,
"There's no plausible scenario under which it really constitutes a serious attack on welfare reform."
Still, the accusation endures. Today, the Republican National Committee released a new ad, and a memo from the Romney campaign this morning included the claim that President Obama gutted welfare. So why keep beating this drum? Well, partly because people believe what they're hearing. Peggy Testa and her husband came to a Paul Ryan rally outside of Pittsburgh yesterday.
You know, we think that the fact that the work requirement has been taken out of welfare is the wrong thing to do.
I told her that's not actually what happened.
You know, I, at this point, don't know exactly what is true and what isn't, okay? But what I do know is I trust the Romney-Ryan ticket, and I do not trust Obama.
Now, that's a very interesting thing. Here, a voter is confronted with the fact that Romney's lying, and she says, well, you know, I don't really know one way or the other, but when it comes right down to it, I trust Romney and I don't trust Obama. Independent of the facts, right? I mean, he's been called out by every fact-checking organization that's looked into it as promoting this kind of big racist lie, and it doesn't matter to his followers that he's lying. He's calling up the racial card again and again and again with no basis in fact. There's other kinds of things that are going on too, and you should be aware of them. They're actually pretty interesting. Take a look at what happens here.
I want to go back to that moment when Mitt Romney made his entrance on Thursday night. He walked down the aisle of the Republican convention, and as he was passing the New York delegation, he shook the hand of the state Republican Party chair, Ed Cox, and then he shook hands with David Koch, actually put his hand on his shoulder, pointed at him, and shook his hand. While Democracy Now! Was there on the floor, we captured the handshake on video. The pool feed that went out that the network's broadcast cut away just before the handshake, showing two enthusiastic young women supporters, and then an overhead shot of the convention center. Then the shot comes back to Romney further down the aisle, shaking hands as he ascended the stage. And we show that split screen for our radio listeners. You can go to democracynow.org. I think it's an interesting metaphor for the money behind the scenes, not highlighted even by the media, Medea.
Well, I think in past conventions, you've seen it more overtly. They'd be giving out the bags, would have the corporate logos on them, and it would be so easy to know who is the sponsors. Now I think the parties are afraid because people are so outraged. I would say on the left and the right, knowing that this presidential election is going to cost $2.5 billion, obscene. If you add the congressional races, you're up to $5.8 billion. That just says that our system is broken. And I think that the two parties are worried about it because the American people are starting to realize that it's very hard to keep calling our system a democracy when it's really being run by a very small elite that is the shadow government.
Okay, well, you get the point. This is, in fact, what's happened with the Koch brothers on things like climate change before. And, in fact, their whole support of the Tea Party is an example of kind of phony grassrootsism. It's been called the AstroTurf movement, not the grassroots movement, but the AstroTurf movement. And you can see that, in fact, this is the Billionaires Convention, and the Tea Party's along because they're paid to be along on this kind of thing. So we'll want to follow this Smirks, Lies, and Videotapes, because it was a Billionaires Convention with the Tea Party brought along for color, and it's something that we ought to keep an eye on here in EcoViews and News. Thanks very much for coming along. See you next week.